Euthanasia is one of the most controversial topics in ethical thought. Through this presentation, we will discuss the arguments for and against euthanasia, as well as provide examples. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, euthanasia is defined as the act or practice of killing or permitting the death of hopelessly sick or injured individuals, such as persons or domestic animals, in relatively painless way for reasons of mercy. Euthanasia is most commonly used in the case of irreversible comas and painful terminal illnesses.
There have been many famous cases of euthanasia over the years, from terminal illness to irreversible coma and to so-called healthy suicide. We will start by talking about terminal illness and the case of Brittany Menard. Brittany Menard was a young student who loved to travel the world and learn new things when she was diagnosed with a fatal brain tumor when she was in her 20s. She didn't want to let the disease consume her life, but found that she was unable to find a way to commit suicide in a way that wouldn't look down upon her or her family. She decided to go to Oregon, which had death with dignity laws that wouldn't put a suicide or a state-assisted or physician-assisted suicide on your death certificate, allowing her death to remain from the tumor while actually easing her pain. She also began a long-term campaign to allow a physician to perform euthanasia on her, as the laws in the United States did not expressly allow it or allow her to obtain the medicine necessary to end her life on her own terms. After a long battle and donations to a couple of foundations, she ended up ending her own life November 1st, 2014. Her request was met with outrage and support on many sides. The Vatican came in to condemn it, while a lot of the right to die activists strongly supported her death. In contrast to Brittany Menard's case, where an individual consented to have euthanasia performed, in the case of Cruzan versus Missouri, there wasn't really a party to give consent. A young girl of the Cruzan family had, in a car accident, entered into a coma and suffered irreversible brain damage. Her parents, struggling to pay the medical bills and mourning their daughter who they believed was dead, opted to remove her feeding tube and euthanize her through minor starvation. The health professionals at the health institute where their daughter was under care refused to do such action, as it would result in her death, sparking a lawsuit that eventually worked its way up to the Supreme Court. In the court ruling, the Missouri State Health Center was found in its rights to withhold euthanasia from Miss Cruzan. However, the court also deposited that if the Cruzan family could find enough evidence that their daughter would have wished for euthanasia to be performed on her, then they would be allowed to perform it. After a couple of months, the Cruzan family did indeed find the evidence and removed their daughter's feeding tube, and she died. This case has become a sort of lightning rod for proponents and opponents of euthanasia. Opponents use this ruling to dictate that individuals do not have a right to die and, in fact, have a right to live, while proponents of euthanasia see this ruling as simply a way to get consent to perform euthanasia. Either way, it remains a contentious issue as more and more people are asked to make this decision for their loved ones. Even though these cases are controversial, at least in the case of Cruzan and Menard, they involved someone who was ill. In the case of Betty and George Kumbayas, one of the parties, Betty, wasn't ill at all. George suffered from a serious heart condition that would eventually lead to his death in 2016. But Betty didn't want to go on living without George in her life, so they propositioned the government of Sweden to allow both of them to be euthanized on the same day at the same time so they could die together. They propositioned Sweden because living in Canada, euthanasia was not legal there. And even in Sweden, they faced numerous obstacles, seeing as Betty was not terminally ill at all. It became one of the greatest controversies euthanasia has faced, as it was not even the case of someone's pain being lessened as it was caused by an illness. It was someone looking to lessen the pain of grief and loss by committing suicide. We may never know what may have happened in this ruling, however, because Betty got cancer and died in 2009, and George lived on until eventually his condition caused him to succumb in 2016. Philosophy can help us address some of this controversy, but philosophers don't always agree. An Aristotelian approach is interesting because, according to Aristotle, euthanasia cannot be allowed because it violates the sanctity of human life. Likewise, euthanasia inflicts harm on oneself, which should be avoided. Aristotle would argue that it is cowardly to fly from troubles, and therefore euthanasia should not be allowed. However, Mill disagrees. According to Mill, whatever promotes the greatest happiness is what determines moral worth. In the case of euthanasia, pain is minimized by killing the individual. This removal of pain allows those around the pained individual to become happier because they no longer have to hear that person suffer. Kant also has his own approach. According to Kant, euthanasia cannot become a universal law because euthanizing a person is using that person as a means to an end. Likewise, asking a person to perform euthanasia is using them as a means to an end. For example, asking a person to kill you is using them as a means to achieve your own end, death. In short, Kant would argue that killing someone is viewing that person as disposable and therefore cannot become universal law.
Now that we have heard what some of the different philosophical viewpoints are, let's hear about how our peers feel about this topic. To get a clearer idea of how people in today's society feel about euthanasia, we interviewed 10 people and asked them what their opinion on euthanasia was. Of those interviewed, 60% felt as though euthanasia is okay depending on the situation. These individuals felt that if a person was in an irreversible coma or had a terminal illness, if the sick person permitted it, euthanasia was okay. However, these individuals felt being euthanized just because a person did not want to live any longer was not all right. The second most common opinion was that euthanasia was never okay. Of those interviewed, 30% felt that under no circumstances should a human be euthanized. These individuals felt that all life is precious, no matter what state it is in. The most uncommon opinion was those in favor of euthanasia. Only one person, or 10% of those interviewed, believed that euthanasia is totally fine as long as the individual or immediate family consents to it. In conclusion, euthanasia is still a very controversial subject. However, we hope this presentation gives you a better understanding of the issues surrounding it and allows you to make your own judgments on the topic.